Welcome, everyone. Today, we're diving into the strange and esoteric world of vampires. Are they really just the stuff of superstition and legend? Or is there a deeper, often overlooked truth behind these stories? Now, I'm not talking about the romanticized vampires you see in movies or TV shows. No glitter, no tortured love triangles. We're tracing these ideas back to their origins, and it's gonna get pretty weird. Were people really just ignorant until the 1890s, chalking everything up to tuberculosis or disease? Or was there something else going on? Some people probably don't know that between 1720 and 1739, vampire cases were being officially documented across Hungary, Moravia, and Silesia. And I'm not just talking about folklore. These were actual government investigations, church inquiries, and academic dissertations from some of Europe's oldest universities. When the Greek Orthodox Church has to write official protocols on how to handle a vampire, you know something strange is going on. Oh, and did you know there's a connection between Freemasonry and early literary vampires like Dracula? That's not even the strangest part of the story. We're going to explore the origins of the vampire, from ancient Assyrian tablets to Vatican archives. We're going to go into documented cases that set entire regions into panic, and uncover the royal and occult connections hidden behind this lore. This is the history of real investigations, real rituals, and real fear that shaped Europe for centuries. So grab some snacks, dim the lights, and let's descend into the rabbit hole of real vampires. When it comes to vampires, most of us picture a caped aristocrat with long fangs, perhaps a depressed teenager who sparkles in the sunlight. But the real vampire, the one that terrorized communities and prompted serious investigations, was something far more terrifying and occult. Vampires are not like what we think of in the modern day. However, there is some truth hidden in the fiction. The reason this subject is treated like folklore or superstition is because it belongs to the realm of the occult. Science doesn't attempt to understand the occult, and so this history becomes lost, buried beneath centuries of skepticism. But these vampires were very real to our ancestors, real enough that popes investigated them, universities studied them, and governments created laws about them. A vampire is neither ghost nor demon, though it shares qualities with both. As the most feared creature in the supernatural world, it exists in a unique category: a corpse that maintains a horrifying form of life after death. Unlike ghosts, vampires have physical bodies. Unlike demons, who are purely spiritual beings, vampires require their original human form to exist. They are, as the old texts tell us, an abnormality, the androgyne in the phantom world, a pariah among the fiends. The vampire phenomenon manifests in two distinct ways. First, there's a physical vampire, a corpse that remains uncorrupted, leaves its grave, and attacks the living. Medieval gravediggers found them, doctors examined them, and officials documented them. Second, there are the occult practices that create vampires through ritual. In both cases, the result is the same: a human spirit that gains enough power to manifest physically and prey upon the living. Blood is central to vampire lore because blood carries the life force itself. Ancient cultures across the world knew this. From biblical texts to tribal rituals, the vampire needs this essence, whether in the form of physical blood or spiritual energy, to maintain its unnatural existence between life and death. Like I said, this phenomenon was taken very seriously. Well, when Pope Benedict XIV is personally reviewing vampire cases, and the University of Leipzig is holding formal dissertations on vampire activity, it would seem this went far beyond simple folklore. But we'll get to those investigations in a bit. This understanding of vampires didn't appear suddenly in medieval Europe. This phenomenon is far older and more universal. The vampire's earliest documented appearance comes from ancient Mesopotamia in the form of the Akimu, the Snatcher. Unlike other spirits of the dead, the Akimu was a particular type of vengeful entity, one who had been denied proper burial rites or died a violent death. The Assyrians had specific exorcisms and rituals to deal with these beings, recognizing them as more dangerous than common ghosts. Clay tablets detail how the Akimu would first appear as a shadow or dark spirit, but could manifest physically to attack its victims. Descriptions vary from legend to legend. Sometimes they were portrayed as winged demons, sometimes walking corpses, sometimes as moving shadows, or even as rushing wind. These tablets describe the Akimu draining both blood and life essence, leaving their victims to waste away slowly while the creature grew stronger with each feeding. In ancient Greece, we find one of the most important foundations of vampire lore. The Greeks understood that blood held power over the dead. This concept is illustrated in Homer's Odyssey. When Ulysses seeks to communicate with the spirits in Hades, he must first dig a deep trench and fill it with blood of black rams. Only by drinking this sacrificial blood could the shades of the dead regain enough substance to speak with the living. This shows an ancient understanding of blood as a bridge between life and death. The Greeks also knew of blood-drinking entities that hunted the living. The Empusa, daughter of the goddess Hecate, was a shape-shifting creature with bronze feet who seduced young men before drinking their blood as they slept. The Lamia is even more terrifying. Once a beautiful mortal, beloved by Zeus, she was transformed into a child-hunting demon after Hera murdered her children. In her grief and rage, she crept into homes at night to drain the blood of sleeping infants. Perhaps most significant were the Strigas, terrifying beings described as having the bodies of crows or birds, who hunted both children and adults for their flesh and blood. This concept even spread into Roman mythology as the Strix, and would later influence vampire legends throughout Eastern Europe, though transformed into different entities like the Romanian Strigoi and the Albanian Striga. The Strix, plural Strigus, was a nocturnal, bird-like creature believed to prey on infants and drink their blood. Derived from earlier Greek mythology, the Strix was originally described as an owl-like being with supernatural qualities. Over time, the term expanded to encompass witches or malevolent spirits, connecting it to occult traditions. These creatures were feared as harbingers of death and illness, with Roman texts recording rituals and incantations to ward them off. The Greeks developed a particularly detailed understanding of what we would come to know as vampires, especially in their concept of the vrikalakas. This term, adopted from Slavic origins, described a specific kind of revenant that was nearly fully ghost nor demon. According to Leon Alici's 1645 study, the vrikalakas was often the body of someone who had lived a wicked life or had been excommunicated by their bishop. These Greek vampires had distinctive characteristics. The body would be found mysteriously preserved, with skin becoming abnormally tough and distended. The corpse would swell until the joints could barely bend, and the skin would grow drum tight, so much so that when struck, it would resound like a drum. This led them to being called timbaniaos, drum-like. The vrikalakas was known to be most active at night, when it would stalk through village streets, knocking on doors and calling out to residents by name. If someone answered this call, they were marked for death within days. On the island of Chios, people learned to never answer a knock at night until they heard it repeated, because if vrikalakas could only call out once. What made these Greek vampires interesting was their ability to appear even in broad daylight. They would suddenly advance upon people in fields, vineyards, and open highways, sometimes killing through sheer terror alone without even touching their victims. The activities of the Vrikalakas are nearly always harmful, ranging from merely leaving their grave and roaming about, through engaging in poltergeist-styled activity, and up to causing epidemics in the community. Ancient Hebrew texts reveal their own unique vampire traditions, centered around a being called the Aluka, literally meaning leech, or Motetz Dam, bloodsucker. The most detailed accounts appear in the Sefer Hasidim, describing a creature that, while living, possessed supernatural abilities including shapeshifting into a wolf and flight. Unlike other vampire myths, these beings were thought to be living humans who practiced blood drinking, though they would die if prevented from feeding for too long. This connection between blood and life was deeply embedded in Hebrew thought, as evidenced by biblical prohibitions and customs surrounding blood consumption. We also can't forget Lilith, who appears in medieval Jewish folklore as Adam's first wife and as a powerful vampiric entity. According to Kabbalistic text, she and her demon daughters would prey upon mothers and newborns, threatening to drink their blood, suck their bones, and eat their flesh. Protection against Lilith required specific amulets and knowledge of her secret names, showing how these beliefs evolved into complex systems of spiritual defense. Among many African tribes, we find crucial early evidence of beliefs that would later connect to vampire traditions. The Shilluk people, who lived along the White Nile, maintained that their dead kings didn't truly die, but instead continued to influence the living. They believed these royal dead could drain the vitality from the tribe if not properly appeased with blood offerings. The Baganda tribe took this further. They would sacrifice hundreds of people when a king died, believing their spirits would nourish the dead monarch. Even more telling, they would bring food offerings to the royal tombs at dawn, convinced that both the dead king and his ghostly retinue needed sustenance to prevent them from preying upon the living. Most significant were the beliefs of the Ovambo, who specifically feared the spirits of dead magicians. These spirits were thought to be so dangerous that immediately after a magician's death, they would sever the corpse's limbs and cut out its tongue. This was done to prevent the dead sorcerer from rising to attack the living, a practice remarkably similar to later European methods of preventing vampire activity. Africa's vampire legends take even more unique forms. The Yu people speak of the Adzi, a vampiric being that appears as an innocent firefly by night, but transforms into a blood-drinking predator. Though strangely, it has a particular taste for coconut water as well. The Ashanti people fear the Obaifo, a creature that can possess living humans, forcing them to drain both blood and life force from their own communities. In China, the vampire took a unique form known as the Jianxi. These beings had a unique way of movement. Rather than walking, they hopped, their bodies stiff with rigor mortis. The Chinese understood these creatures could sustain themselves on more than just blood. They could drain a person's breath, their life force, or their yang essence. This connects to the earlier point about vampires feeding on both physical and spiritual energy. The Japanese have the Nukakubi, vampires that can detach their heads from their body at night. The head flies around independently, searching for human prey, making a distinct hissing sound as it moves. During the day, these creatures appear completely human, though careful observers might notice faint line marks around their necks. The Malay people speak of an entity called the Lang Swir, a female vampire who appears as a beautiful woman, but can be identified by a hole in the back of her neck, through which she feeds on children. Then there is the Penanggalan, who appears as a floating female head with trailing entrails, feeding on the blood of women in childbirth. The Filipino vampire is the manananggal. At night, these creatures split their bodies in half, leaving their lower portion hidden while their upper torso flies through the air with bat-like wings. They're also said to be particularly vicious, using an elongated tongue to drain fetuses from pregnant women and the hearts of unborn children. In ancient Mexico, long before European contact, the Aztecs feared a unique and tragic form of vampire, the Cihuateteo. These entities weren't created through evil deeds or dark magic, but through the sacred act of childbirth itself. The Aztecs believed that labor was a spiritual battle between a woman and the gods, who sent down the soul of a child from heaven. If the woman died during this divine combat, she was honored as a fallen warrior, but she was also transformed into something terrifying. They would manifest in multiple forms, sometimes as animals like coyotes or snakes, other times in a horrifying human shape with chalk-white skin and long claws. Some were said to carry staffs decorated with the heads of their victims, their waists encircled by living serpents. Having lost their own chance at motherhood, they sought to steal children, inflicting seizures and disease upon their victims. In Chile, the Mapuche people tell of Peuchen, a shape-shifting creature that could transform into a snake, a blood-sucking leech, or even take human form. It would first paralyze its victims with its penetrating stare before feeding. The Incas had their own hierarchy of blood-drinking deities and spirits, many associated with sacrifice and the transfer of life force. In Peru, legends speak of the Pishtaco, beings that would attack travelers at night to drain their fat and blood, believing these fluids contained the essence of life itself. Among Native American tribes, particularly the Cherokee, we find the story of the Raven Mocker, who would drain the blood and life force from the dying to extend their own existence. This being could appear as either a human or a large bird, and only medicine people could see their true form. Raven Mockers are believed to gather at the homes of those who are dying, tormenting their victims by lifting them from their beds, pressing down on their chests to restrict breathing, or throwing them to the ground. Once the victim dies, the Raven Mocker removes the heart and consumes it, taking the remaining years of the victim's life. Though no marks are left on the body, the heart is said to be gone. In India, there's a rich tradition of blood drinking with entities like the Vitala, more commonly known as the Betal. These beings were neither fully ghost nor demon, but undead creatures that haunted cremation grounds and cemeteries. Like the bats later associated with vampirism, they would hang upside down from trees, waiting for victims. The most famous accounts of the Vitala come from the Betal Pancha Bingshati, which includes the legendary tale of King Vikramaditya and his nightly attempts to capture one of these elusive creatures. The Vitala weren't the only vampiric entities in Indian lore. The Pishascha were the returned spirits of evildoers and those who died insane, cursed to feed upon the living. These beings could possess and reanimate corpses, moving from body to hunt. Then there were the Brahma Purusha, who would drink blood from human skulls and devour the brains of their victims, gaining power from each feeding. In Arabia, there's the ghoul, a creature fundamentally different from the sanitized versions in modern fiction. These entities haunted graveyards and lonely places, feeding on both the living and the dead. The Arabic word ghoul comes from gala, meaning to seize, as these creatures would snatch travelers from their paths. Female ghouls could appear as beautiful women to lure their prey, only to reveal their true monstrous form before feeding. The deserts of Arabia held another entity, the Al Ghul, a specific type of female vampire who could detach her head from her body at night to fly in search of victims. Like the Malay Penanggalan, the Al Ghul was particularly drawn to attack pregnant women and newborn infants, draining their blood and consuming their flesh. Blood-drinking revenants show up in Aboriginal Australian traditions too. The Yadamayahu is a small red creature with octopus-like suckers on its fingers and toes. It drops from fig trees onto victims, draining their blood through these suckers, then swallows and regurgitates them. Each time the victim becomes a little redder until they eventually transform into another Yadamayahu. The origins of the vampire stretch back to our earliest civilizations, appearing in every region's spiritual tradition. While each culture develops its own unique vampire lore, distinct patterns emerge that suggest these weren't merely random stories, but attempts to explain real phenomena. The most universal element is blood. This isn't surprising. Ancient peoples understood blood as sacred, as the vessel of the soul. A pattern emerges in how many cultures describe vampiric entities that can detach their heads or split their bodies. The Arabic al-Ghul, the Japanese Nukekubi, the Filipino Manananggal, and the Malay Penanggagalan all share this trait. This suggests something beyond mere coincidence. Perhaps these civilizations were attempting to describe a spiritual phenomenon where consciousness could separate from the physical form to hunt victims. The shape-shifting aspect of vampires, appearing as animals or changing form, connects deeply to shamanic traditions worldwide. Like the skinwalkers of Native American lore, many cultures believed powerful practitioners could transform themselves in the spirit world. The Raven Mocker of the Cherokee, the Peuchin of Chile, and various African vampires all display this ability, suggesting ancient connections between vampirism and early magical practices. The core essence of vampirism isn't just about folklore. It's about the fundamental act of sustaining oneself through the life force of another being. This vampiric behavior exists throughout nature, suggesting our ancestors recognized this pattern long before they crafted their vampire myths. The most obvious example is, of course, the vampire bat. These creatures have evolved specialized teeth and digestive systems purely for blood consumption. Vampire bats are the only mammals that exclusively feed on blood. They even have anticoagulant proteins in their saliva, now used in modern medicine. Vampiric creatures manifest in other ways, as with leeches, ticks, and mosquitoes that survive purely through blood feeding, or hematophagy as scientists call it. This gets deeper when we look at parasites, creatures that must drain life force from a host to survive. From microscopic organisms to larger parasitic worms, nature is full of beings that mirror vampiric behavior. Even the basic act of consuming other living beings have a vampiric quality that ancient peoples recognized. When we consider that blood carries life essence, as acknowledged in Leviticus, the life of all flesh is in the blood, we see why consuming blood was treated with such specific religious and cultural protocols. Ancient kosher laws, for instance, required all blood to be drained from meat, acknowledging that while consuming flesh was permitted, consuming the life force itself, the blood, was a different matter entirely. Blood worship has held a powerful and sacred significance in human history. In ancient Mesopotamia, blood was central to rituals honoring the gods, as seen in the creation myth Enuma Elish, where the god Marduk slays Tiamat and uses her blood to form humanity. This act symbolized both the divine origin of life and the perpetual bond between mortals and their deities, maintained through blood sacrifices. The Akkadians and Babylonians continued this practice, offering blood to the gods to ensure prosperity, protection, and balance in the cosmic order. In Mesoamerica, blood was viewed as the ultimate gift to the gods, essential for sustaining the universe. The Aztecs performed elaborate human sacrifices, believing that the sun required human blood to rise each day. Victims were often war captives, their hearts offered on temple altars, while their blood flowed down the steps of sacred pyramids. These rituals were overseen by priests who believed the spilling of blood directly appeased gods. Similar beliefs can be found in Mayan culture, where rulers performed ritual bloodletting using sharp obsidian tools to draw their own blood as an offering. In ancient Greece and Rome, animal sacrifices were a cornerstone of religious ceremonies, with the blood of bulls, goats, or lambs sprinkled on altars to please gods like Zeus or Apollo. These sacrifices were often accompanied by oracles or divination, where priests interpreted the flow or appearance of blood for divine messages. In the Roman Empire of the 2nd to 4th centuries, the Taurobolium referred to practices involving the sacrifice of a bull, which after the mid-2nd century became connected with the worship of the Great Mother of Gods, Cybele. After 159 AD, all private Taurobolian inscriptions mention the Magna Mater. This ritual is also referenced in several medieval manuscripts, along with the Galli, priests who would mutilate themselves for this cult, engaging in another form of bloodletting. The thread connecting many ancient gods across cultures is their insatiable demand for blood, often given willingly by their followers in sacrifice. Whether it was the Aztec gods who needed human blood to sustain the sun, or Jehovah in the Hebrew Bible, who required animal sacrifices to atone for sins. These deities displayed an almost vampiric reliance on blood as a source of power or sustenance. Even the Christian ritual of consuming the blood of Christ in the Eucharist reflects an ancient tradition of blood as a vessel of divine power, and its symbolic drinking to gain eternal life carries unmistakably vampiric overtones. These ancient vampiric entities have always existed, manifesting across every civilization in strikingly similar ways. From the shamanic understanding of spirit predators to the complex magical defenses developed by ancient priests and magicians. The consistencies we see, the power of blood as life force, the ability to move between physical and spiritual realms, the connection to magical practices, point to genuine phenomena that our ancestors understood far better than we do today. But it was in Europe where these entities would make themselves known most powerfully, leading to a wave of encounters that would force both church and state to confront forces they could no longer ignore. European vampires stand apart from similar legends around the world due to their deeply physical nature. Unlike spectral beings or purely spiritual predators found in other cultures, European vampires are believed to inhabit their corpses, leaving the grave to attack the living. This blending of the physical and supernatural made them uniquely terrifying and rooted in local fears of death, disease, and improper burial. One of the most significant early records comes from the medieval Greece with the Vrikalakas. In these accounts, improper burial or excommunication from the church was often blamed for creating a vampire. Religious authorities emphasized proper rites to prevent the dead from returning, setting the stage for later church protocols on the issue. The term vampire was not originally used in many of the cases now associated with the phenomenon. The term derives from the Hungarian vampir, which itself traces its origins to various Slavonic languages, such as Russian upir, Polish upir, and Serbian vampir. In its earliest iterations, the concept of the vampire was described without the specific word we recognize today. Many historical cases of revenants, particularly in Western Europe, lacked the explicit designation of vampire. Instead, these entities were often referred to with terms indicating restless spirits or revenants, emphasizing their connection to the undead rather than to a distinct supernatural classification. One of the earliest European accounts of a figure with vampiric traits comes from the epic poem Beowulf, composed between the 8th and early 11th centuries. The character of Grendel is described as a shadow-dwelling, bloodthirsty cannibal who preys on the warriors of Heorot Hall, attacking at night and leaving destruction in his wake. His monstrous appetite and nocturnal predation displays qualities later associated with vampiric entities, including the draining of life from his victims. By the 12th and 13th centuries, fears of vampirism had become widespread enough to attract official attention. Due to these events, the Fourth Lateran Council convened in 1215 under Pope Innocent III. It established formal distinctions between demonic possession and other spiritual abnormalities, including those tied to the restless dead. Vampirism was described as being closely linked to ideas of sin, excommunication, and the inability of certain souls to find rest. Excommunication in particular was thought to sever a person from the spiritual protections of the church, leaving their soul in turmoil. In regions influenced by the Greek Orthodox tradition, this belief evolved into fears that excommunicated individuals could physically return as restless undead. These corpses were often described as uncorrupted, with fresh appearances defying natural decay, a feature commonly associated with vampirism. The church's influence extended to burial practices, where improper rites or unholy deaths, such as suicides, were seen as potential causes of vampirism. Clergy were frequently called to intervene in suspected cases, performing exorcisms, consecrating graves, or even overseeing disinterments. The church's involvement in vampiric phenomena continued to evolve over the centuries. One of the most significant figures in this history was Pope Benedict XIV, who conducted detailed investigations into reports of vampires in the 18th century. Benedict XIV's writing addressed the distinction between miracles, supernatural events, and phenomena such as vampirism. He treated vampire reports with caution, framing them as part of the broader theological debate on the boundaries between divine intervention and demonic activity. Academic interest in vampires also grew, with universities tackling the subject as a serious matter of inquiry. The University of Leipzig became a hub for these discussions during the 17th and 18th centuries. Dissertations by scholars like Christian Frederick Garman and Michael Rampt examined the nature of vampires, their origins, and how they might fit within theological and natural frameworks. Ramft's work is particularly notable for its detailed analysis of vampiric corpses and their supposed behaviors. A key point of contention in these discussions was distinguishing vampires from demons. Religious authorities debated whether vampires were animated by demonic forces or if they represented a separate, unique category of the undead. Demons were seen as purely spiritual beings, while vampires were considered tied to the physical realm through their preserved corpses. This distinction became central to how the church and scholars approached cases of suspected vampirism. Leon Alici's 1645 study offered valuable insights into the Greek Orthodox tradition and its belief about vampires. Alici detailed the practices surrounding the vrikalakas, including methods to identify and destroy these restless corpses. Similar accounts emerged in other parts of Europe during the late medieval period. In Bohemia and Poland, chroniclers recorded instances where villagers reported strange deaths and sightings of restless corpses. These incidents often prompted exhumations, with witnesses describing uncorrupted bodies, blood at the mouth, or even signs of movement within the grave. Clergy and local leaders took these reports seriously, often involving rituals to destroy the suspected vampire, such as staking, decapitation, or burning. In the Balkans, suspected vampires were often staked through the chest or pinned to the ground with iron rods to prevent them from rising. Burial sites were sometimes surrounded by thorns or blessed by priests to protect the living from further attacks. By the 15th century, vampire fears were widespread across Europe. In Transylvania and Wallachia, suspected vampires were staked and decapitated, with graves often surrounded by protective measures like thorns or iron bars. In Bohemia and Poland, chroniclers noted similar practices, describing exhumations where bodies were found intact with signs of recent feeding, such as blood at the mouth or in the chest cavity. Clergy and local leaders took active roles in these cases, performing blessings or supervising the destruction of suspected vampires. Medieval demonology often linked vampiric traits with entities like the incubi or succubi, supernatural beings known for their predatory and sexual nature. These demons, prominently mentioned in the Malleus Maleficarum and King James I and VI Demonology 1597, were believed to seduce victims and drain their vitality, sometimes through blood consumption or flesh devouring. Succubi in particular were associated with female seduction, paralleling later vampire traditions that tied blood drinking to sexuality and allure. By the late medieval period, these regional practices and beliefs were firmly established, setting the stage for the vampire epidemics of the 17th and 18th centuries. Such widespread and methodical responses, carried out by both frightened villagers and clergy alongside local authorities, demonstrate the extent to which this phenomenon was taken as a genuine threat. It is difficult to dismiss these accounts as mere superstition, given their consistency across regions and the involvement of respected leaders. Either we accept that our ancestors were irrationally accusing the dead of causing unexplained events, despite detailed reports of physical phenomena, or we must confront the possibility of a deeply occult reality that defies modern understanding. There are countless documented cases that challenge the idea that these events were merely the result of illness or superstition, pointing instead to entities that people believed were real and dangerous enough to require decisive action. William of Newburgh, a 12th century English historian and Augustinian canon from Yorkshire, recorded some of the earliest and most detailed accounts of vampiric activity in Europe. Renowned for his Historia Rerum Anglicarum, History of English Affairs, William's work is respected for its balanced commentary. Yet his descriptions of the undead stand out as some of the most vivid accounts of their kind. He recounted multiple cases of restless corpses terrorizing communities, particularly in Yorkshire, based on what he deemed credible testimonies. In one notable case, a man notorious for his sinful life was reported to arise from his grave, spreading fear and disease among the locals. Witnesses described him visiting his wife, nearly crushing her under his weight, and later haunting his brothers when they intervened. When the grave was exhumed, the body was found bloated, lifelike, and suffused with blood, a sign often linked to vampirism. Following local practices, the corpse was burned, ending the disturbances. William also emphasized how widespread such accounts were during his time, noting that stories of the undead were not isolated incidents. Other prominent historians such as William of Malmesbury and Walter Map documented similar cases of vampires, or revenants as they were called. These tales also appear in the writings of continental authors like Caesarius von Histerbach, a German Cistercian monk, and even in secular literature, including Old Norse sagas that recount encounters with the restless dead. Jure Grando, a 17th century villager from Kringa, Istria, modern-day Croatia, became one of the earliest documented cases of vampirism in European history. Grando died in 1656, but according to local accounts, began rising from his grave 16 years later in 1672. His nocturnal appearances terrorized the community. Villagers claimed he would knock on doors, and within days, someone in the household would fall ill and die. Grando's posthumanist visits were not limited to random acts of terror. His widow reportedly described him appearing in her home, smiling eerily and attempting to assault her. The villagers, fearing for their lives, sought guidance from the local priest, Father Giorgio, and together they planned to confront this menace. Led by Father Giorgio and Prefect Miho Radatic, a group of villagers exhumed Grando's grave. They found his corpse remarkably preserved, with a sinister smile frozen on his face. Several attempts to drive a hawthorn stake through his heart failed, as the stake inexplicably bounced off his chest. Finally, one of the villagers took an axe and decapitated the body. Witnesses claimed the corpse let out a horrifying scream, and blood poured from the wound. After this act, the haunting ceased, and peace returned to Kringa. In 1701, French botanist Joseph Piton de Tournefort visited the Greek island of Mykonos and documented a chilling encounter with a Vrikolakas. The incident began with the mysterious murder of a local peasant, known for his quarrelsome nature. 2 days after his burial, villagers reported sightings of his apparition at night, engaging in mischievous acts like overturning furniture and extinguishing lamps. Initially, these disturbances were met with skepticism and even amusement. However, as the incidents persisted and more residents reported encounters, the community's concern grew. In response, local priests and town leaders convened and decided to exhume the body to perform a ritual aimed at expelling the supposed demon. The town butcher was tasked with removing the heart. But despite the removal and burning of the heart, the hauntings reportedly continued, escalating to more violent acts. Ultimately, the townspeople decided to cremate the entire body, a measure believed to be the most effective way to ensure the Vrikolakas would not return. Following the cremation, peace was restored to Mykonos. In 1725, in the village of Kiselova in Serbia, a peasant named Petar Blagojevic died, and following his death, the village experienced a series of sudden fatalities. Within 8 days, 9 villagers died after brief, severe illnesses. On their deathbeds, several victims reportedly claimed that Blagojevic had visited and throttled them at night. Amid growing panic, villagers sought the presence of Imperial Provisor Ernst Frumbalt and the local priest to witness the exhumations of Blagojevic's body. Upon disinterment, the corpse appeared remarkably well preserved, with new skin and nails and blood at the mouth, signs interpreted as evidence of vampirism. The villagers proceeded to stake the body through the heart, causing fresh blood to flow from the ears and mouth, and then burn the remains. Rumbolt's official report was published in the Viennese newspaper, spreading the story across Europe. The involvement of imperial officials demonstrated how seriously such cases were taken at the time. In 1727, the village of Medvedja in Serbia became the epicenter of one of the most renowned vampire cases in history, involving a man named Arnold Baule. Baule, a former soldier, had previously recounted encounters with a vampire during his military service in Greece, claiming to have protected himself by consuming earth from the vampire's grave and smearing himself with his blood. Despite these precautions, shortly after his death from an incident, villagers reported seeing him posthumously, and within weeks, several residents died after brief illnesses, allegedly after experiencing nocturnal visitations from Paule. Alarmed by these events, local authorities exhumed Paule's body and found it remarkably well preserved, with fresh blood evident, a condition they interpreted as vampirism. They proceeded to stake his heart, during which the corpse reportedly emitted a groan, and then they burned the body. Despite these measures, a second wave of deaths occurred 5 years later, in 1732, leading to further exhumations and similar findings. This prompted the involvement of Austrian military officials who documented the occurrences in detailed reports. These accounts were widely disseminated across Europe, notably appearing in publications such as the London Journal, sparking widespread interest and debate about the existence of vampires. In November 1761, the Lamb Inn, a 17th century establishment in Bristol, became the center of a series of unsettling events that persisted for over a year. The disturbances began in the bedroom shared by Molly and Dobby Giles, daughter of the landlord Richard Giles. Initially, the girls reported hearing scratching and rapping noises. Over time, the phenomena escalated to include furniture moving on its own and the girls suffering from unexplained bites, pinches, and scratches. Local druggist Henry Durbin documented these occurrences, noting that the bite marks often appeared in real time, accompanied by saliva, and were witnessed by multiple observers. Durbin's accounts, published in 1800, described the girls being thrown from their beds with such force that even several men couldn't hold them down. Attempts to communicate with the entity through coded knocking revealed claims of witchcraft, suggesting that the arrival of Richard Giles had enlisted a witch from Mansfield to curse the family. The situation intensified when Richard Giles died suddenly in May 1762, after a mysterious incident involving his horse's harness breaking. The spirit allegedly claimed responsibility for his death, attributing it to witchcraft. In a bid to end the torment, Miss Giles sought help from the White Witch of Bedminster, who performed rituals that eventually ceased the disturbances. In the mid-18th century, the region around Temesvar, Romania, became the site of widespread reports of vampiric activity. Villages such as Stamara and Vermesh described mysterious deaths where victims reportedly fell ill after experiencing vivid nightmares of being attacked by a figure pressing on their chest. Others claimed to have seen shadowy forms near the homes of the afflicted shortly before their deaths. These unsettling patterns prompted Austrian authorities to launch formal investigations, including medical examinations of the deceased, an indication of how seriously such occurrences were treated by both local communities and imperial officials. One of the key documents from this period, the Visum Repertum, detailed the findings from these investigations. In several cases, exhumed bodies were found uncorrupted, with blood at the mouth or under the nails. These signs were taken as definitive evidence of vampirism, leading to measures such as staking and burning the remains. Villagers reported that these actions ended the mysterious deaths, further solidifying the belief that something unnatural was at work. There are countless more cases to explore, including those in Styria, Moravia, and other regions stretching even into the early 20th century. These supernatural attacks were widespread and met with some serious responses from both local communities and authorities. While some might argue these events stemmed from a misunderstanding of disease, such explanations fall short when considering the reports of uncorrupted bodies, shadowy apparitions, and even bite marks. More interestingly, the mysterious deaths and illnesses often ceased only after the suspected vampires were destroyed. Cases of unexplained biting have been recorded throughout history. Victims reported waking with bite marks on their necks or wrist, while others discovered livestock mysteriously drained of blood. In many instances, these events led to the exhumations of graves, where the bodies were reportedly found intact or displaying signs of unnatural preservation. By the 17th century, vampirism had become a topic of serious academic study. Scholars sought to understand the phenomenon from theological, medical, and philosophical perspectives. Philip Rohr's 1679 thesis on the chewing dead is one of the earliest works to analyze the behaviors attributed to vampires. Rohr focused on the belief that corpses could chew on their burial shrouds, an act thought to spread disease and death among the living. He argued that this phenomenon deserved theological scrutiny due to its widespread acceptance in European communities. Christian Frederick Armand, writing in 1670, approached the subject from a medical perspective. In his treatise, Armand examined the physical signs often attributed to vampirism, such as the preservation of corpses and the appearance of fresh blood. He questioned the supernatural explanations behind these cases, suggesting that natural processes like decomposition might account for some of the observations. Despite his skeptical approach, Armand's work acknowledged the psychological and cultural grip that vampire beliefs held over society. On Michael Ramp's 1728 work, On the Chewing of the Dead in Graves, expanded on earlier studies of vampirism. Rampt provided detailed accounts of exhumed corpses, focusing on reports of fresh blood, bloating, and uncorrupted appearances. He examined these cases in the context of religious beliefs and folk practices, emphasizing the need for both theological and practical responses to the phenomenon. Johann Christian Stock's 1732 analysis of vampirism came during the height of the vampire epidemic in Eastern Europe. His work delved into specific cases from regions like Moravia and Hungary, documenting exhumations and the rituals performed to destroy suspected vampires. Stock approached the phenomenon with skepticism, attempting to explain the reports through natural causes such as post-mortem changes in the body. Nevertheless, his detailed accounts remain an important resource for understanding how these fears spread across Europe. In 1746, Dom Augustin Calmet, a French Benedictine monk, published the Treatise on the Apparitions of Spirits and on Vampires, which became one of the most comprehensive works on the subject. Calmet examined a wide range of accounts, from documented cases in Eastern Europe to theological debates about the nature of vampirism. He did treat the subject with the careful balance of skepticism and belief, acknowledging both the cultural impact of vampire stories and the possibility of supernatural involvement. But this work remains one of the most influential works on vampirism, bridging the gap between folklore and academic inquiry. Giuseppe Davanza's 1744 dissertation on vampires contributed an Italian perspective to the growing body of vampire studies. Davanza's work analyzed the origin of vampire beliefs, connecting them to both historical accounts and contemporary reports. He emphasized the importance of distinguishing between regional folklore and actual cases, offering insights into how these fears influence burial practices and societal norms. These European vampire cases reveal consistent physical traits that investigators use to identify suspected vampires. Corpses were often described as having a flushed or darkened complexion, with blood visible around the mouth, suggesting recent feeding. The bodies were frequently swollen or distended, a condition thought to result from the consumption of blood. Additional characteristics of vampirism in corpses further supported these beliefs. Suspected vampires showed little to no decomposition, often appearing fresh despite being buried for weeks or months. Witnesses reported hair and nail growth, along with the shedding of old skin, phenomena that added to the claim of ongoing vitality. In some cases, autopsies revealed a liver described as unnaturally white or pale in the presence of liquid blood within the body, both which were seen as evidence of vampiric activity. The belief in how vampires were created varied across Europe, but certain patterns emerged in historical accounts. Improper burial rites were one of the most commonly cited causes, as they were believed to leave the soul restless and prone to returning as a vampire. Suicides and murder victims, whose deaths were considered unnatural, were also thought to be at a higher risk. Plague victims, due to their association with widespread death and disease, were often blamed for outbreaks of vampirism. In some regions, more specific conditions were believed to predispose individuals to becoming vampires, such as being born with a red caul over the face, an extra nipple, or other unusual birthmarks. Folklore even suggested that if an animal, such as a dog or cat, jumped over a corpse, it could transform the deceased into a vampire. Once a vampire was suspected, specific prevention and destruction methods were employed to neutralize the threat. Staking the body, often through the chest, abdomen, or mouth, was a common practice, with different regions specifying particular woods like ash, hawthorn, or oak for their potency. Decapitation was another widely used method, ensuring the vampire could no longer rise. Some burial customs included placing the body face down to confuse the undead, or inserting objects such as a brick, coin, or stone into the mouth to prevent feeding. Tools like sickles were positioned around the grave to harm the body if it attempted to move. Other methods like scattering sand or seeds on the grave were based on the belief that vampires were compelled to count the grains, delaying their emergence. Strong smells such as garlic or tar were also used to repel the undead and safeguard the living. While some of these practices may seem extreme or rooted in superstition, the accounts suggest a dual nature to the vampire phenomenon in European history. On one hand, there were reports of unexplained supernatural encounters, implying that the vampire was a non-physical entity using a body as a talisman to persist. On the other hand, the widespread belief in physical reanimation led to practices aimed at preventing corpses from rising, such as staking or decapitation. Though some of these practices may have fueled modern skepticism, they do not diminish the possibility that a genuine occult phenomenon was at work, a threat that communities and authorities of the time took very seriously. Now we must discuss the most famous vampire of them all, Dracula. But who is the real Dracula, and how did this story become one of the most famous novels of all time? Something that I haven't really seen discussed is the connection between vampires, Dracula, and Tartaria, as it would appear there is some lost alternative history involving this subject. Everyone has heard of the real historical figure that Dracula is based on, Vlad the Impaler. But how and why is this associated with vampires? What is the Order of the Dragon, and how does it connect to Tartaria? Bram Stoker's Dracula was published in 1897 and has become one of the most iconic Gothic novels of all time. The story unfolds through journal entries, letters, and newspaper clippings following a group of protagonists who confront Count Dracula, an ancient vampire from Transylvania seeking to spread his influence into England. Dracula is depicted as a figure of immense power and ancient lineage, tied to an aristocratic and warrior class that elevates him beyond a mere monster. Stoker drew inspiration from a variety of sources, including Eastern European folklore, historical accounts, and earlier vampire novels. Works like John Polidori's The Vampire, 1819, and Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, 1872, which shaped the image of vampires as seductive and aristocratic, rather than grotesque, decayed corpses described in traditional folklore. Stoker built upon this foundation, incorporating historical figures like Vlad the Impaler and medieval legends to craft a vampire that was both fearsome and cunning. Unlike the bloated and decayed figures of historical lore, Stoker's Dracula is portrayed as elegant, intelligent, and highly influential, blending seamlessly into society while carrying out his predatory goals. The depiction not only modernized the vampire myth, but also reinforced Dracula's role as a shadowy figure of elite power and hidden danger. Now, there are a few more novels that contributed to the foundation of Dracula. One of the earliest examples is a German poem titled The Vampire, 1748, by Heinrich August Ossenfelder, which explored themes of seduction and revenge through vampirism and emphasized the importance of blood in sustaining the vampire. Later, in the mid-19th century, Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood, 1845 to 1847, became a popular story in England. It featured Sir Francis Varney, an aristocratic vampire whose predatory behavior included draining his victims during gruesome feast of blood. But here's what has been lost and conveniently never mentioned. Did you know that Bram Stoker was a master mason? Rarely will you hear that mentioned, and it's not just Dracula, but many early vampire novels before the 20th century were deeply associated with and influenced by Freemasonry. This is not a conspiracy, but a historical fact that hints at something more secretive and occult surrounding the concept of the vampire, even in literary form. Stoker's own Masonic journey began in 1883, when he was initiated into the Buckingham and Chandos Lodge in London, eventually becoming a Master Mason. During this time, he mingled with influential figures including Sir Henry Irving, whose charisma and mystique likely inspired elements of Count Dracula himself. Even John William Polidori, the author of The Vampire, was a Freemason. Initiated in 1818, Polidori not only created the first modern vampire tale in English, but also served as Lord Byron's personal physician. The central character, Lord Ruthven, was based directly on Byron, capturing his charisma and infamous reputation. When The Vampire was first published in 1819, it was initially attributed to Byron himself, reinforcing the connection between the two figures. Byron himself came from a family with strong ties to Freemasonry. His great uncle was strangely called the Wicked Lord and served as Grand Master of the Premier Grand Lodge from 1747 to 1751. The Wicked Lord was infamous for hosting ritualistic gatherings at his Gothic estate, Newstead Abbey, which is very suspicious and implies that there were secretive practices within elite Masonic circles. He also was known for killing his neighbor, William Chaworth, over a simple argument. The case led to a trial in the House of Lords in 1765, but he avoided imprisonment by paying a fine, walking free despite the scandal. Both Byron and Polidori were influenced by this blend of aristocratic privilege, occult associations, and shadowy rituals which undoubtedly shaped the creation of Lord Ruthven as a dark, aristocratic vampire figure. While there is no clear evidence that the author of Carmilla, Le Fanu, was a Freemason, his earlier novel, The House by the Churchyard, 1863, contains an intriguing reference to Masonic themes. Quote, "The sourest dog I ever broke bread with, and Mason, if you please, by Jove, a Prince Pelican. He supped at the Grand Lodge after labor one night. You're not a Mason? I see. Tipped you the sign." End quote. He's describing this ugly, displeasing to look at Mason as not just a regular member, but a member of a royal secret society, hinting toward the Rosicrucians. Which is interesting because the mother pelican represents sacrifice, with her babies feeding on her own blood. Then it mentions dining at the Grand Lodge after work, at night, before directly saying, "You're not a Mason? I see. Tipped you the sign," openly referencing secret gestures only recognizable to those within the order. Are we really to believe that this guy isn't a Mason? In Carmilla, the female vampire is Countess Mircalla, who comes from a noble bloodline and is deeply tied to themes of secrecy and seduction. Her vampirism is not just a random affliction either. It's presented as tied to her ancient lineage, almost like an inheritance or privilege, like a passed down rite or even ritual. Another interesting detail in this novel is that the vampire appears youthful, yet has experienced centuries, implying that her vampirism, or this occult knowledge, is what keeps her young. This novel is basically a lesbian vampire story. Another common motif of early 19th century vampire literature is the sexual and manipulative nature of these creatures. Carmilla's aristocratic lineage is tied to a house named Karnstein, which emphasizes that she's not a creature of the night, but is actually part of an inherited legacy. Our vampirism is not a curse, but a part of an ancient system of power and secrecy. Quote, "And this was once the palatial residence of the Karnsteins," said the old general at length. As far from a great window, he looked out across the village and saw the wide, undulating expanse of forest. It was a bad family, and here its blood-stained annals were written, he continued. It is hard that they should, after death, continue to plague the human race with their atrocious lust. End quote. The author's name even translates to the Faun, a symbol often associated with Freemasonry and the concept of sexual predators, as Pan, the god of lust and physical satisfaction, is one of its primary archetypes. The name Karnstein has evolved in vampire lore, notably inspiring the Karnstein trilogy of films. In La Fille de Dracula, the name appears as Karlstein, which could be connected to the Karlstein Castle near Prague. Founded in 1348 by Charles IV, this Gothic castle was designed to safeguard imperial regalia and holy relics. It's noteworthy that Carinthia, German Karnten, is a region southwest of Styria, aligning with the setting of Le Fanu's novel. Le Fanu may have drawn inspiration from the area, possibly influencing his choice of the name Karnstein, and some suggest that it was based on an actual family name that is now lost. In the movie Lust for a Vampire, one of the films in the Karnstein trilogy, there is an interesting scene where the history of the Karnstein family is discussed. While it may be fictional, it does offer a glimpse into their lore. A teacher explains how much of Karnstein's history has been lost, noting that the first recorded mention of the family appears in the now lost Styrian Chronicles of 1187, which is described as the equivalent of England's Doomsday Book. This detail is based on an actual English manuscript, making it an interesting connection worth bringing up. Additionally, the coat of arms associated with the Styria region features what is described as a white panther. However, it is actually breathing fire, and this same design can also be found on shields that include a griffin or a dragon. Now let's discuss Varney the Vampire. While the author Reimer is not clearly a Freemason, although it has been suggested that he was actually a Mason, the publisher of Varney and other popular stories like Sweeney Todd, Edward Lloyd, was indeed a Freemason. Edward Lloyd had a policy where authors were not allowed to put their name on their published work, so in the original cover you only see his name. This is most likely where the idea for fangs on a vampire came from, but yet again, we have a wealthy aristocrat as a vampire. According to Varney, he was cursed with vampirism after he betrayed a royalist to Oliver Cromwell, and subsequently killed his own son accidentally in a fit of anger. Oliver Cromwell is a real historical figure, and interestingly enough, was accused in the 18th century of founding Freemasonry. This theory was put forward by Abbé Loredan, an 18th century French Catholic writer who claimed in 1745 that Cromwell founded and initiated his closest friends into Freemasonry. Whether this claim is true or not remains debated by Masons to this day. However, this indisputably connects Freemasons to vampires once again, as this is the very act that led to Varney becoming a vampire. This is only the beginning of the elite and secret society connections to the literary vampire. As we have noted, every single early vampire novel was either influenced by or directly written by Freemasons, a historical fact that is conveniently glossed over. With this in mind, we can delve further into the real historical connections behind Dracula and then examine how this all ties together. Okay, let's discuss Vlad the Impaler, commonly acknowledged as the real Dracula. No, I'm not gonna approach this as other videos or documentaries have, as I feel they're missing the alternative history aspect to all of this. But to begin, let's briefly connect Vlad to Dracula and discuss the meaning of Dracula itself. The name Dracula derives from the Romanian Draculia, meaning son of Dracul. Vlad's father, Vlad II, was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order established to protect Christianity, which earned him the title Dracul, or the Dragon. Thus, Vlad III inherited the name, linking him directly to the sinister connotations that would later inspire Stoker's vampire. But is that the only connection linking them? This is what we're told about Vlad III in mainstream history. Vlad III, known as Vlad the Impaler, was born in 1431 in Transylvania. He ruled Wallachia 3 separate times between 1448 and 1476. Vlad earned his infamous title due to his preferred method of execution, impaling enemies on stakes, a gruesome display meant to instill fear in his foes and cement his authority. He is celebrated as a hero in Romania for his defense against the Ottoman Empire, but equally reviled elsewhere for his brutal tactics. Interestingly, there is a locality named Tartaria in Romania, where there are the Tartaria tablets, clay tablets with signs on them that were discovered to be around 5,000 years old, older than the cuneiform writing in Mesopotamia. According to PhD and expert on Hungarian history, Tibor Barat, in his Prehistory of the Hungarian Peoples, states that the runic signs on the Tartalaca disc correspond to the Scythian Hun-Hungarian runic script. If you're new to Tartaria, I suggest checking out the Tartaria playlist. But as we've discussed in other videos, the Tartarians are the Scythians. Tartaria is referenced on several old maps with references to ancient Scythia. Not only that, but the flag for Tartaria was the dragon. But what is the relationship to Transylvania and Vlad the Impaler? The Scythians were the Dragon Empire. According to Greek mythology, the Dracaena Scythia was the first ruler of the land of Scythia. She was a woman from the waist up with the tail of a serpent in place of legs. When Hercules was traveling through her realm with the cattle of Geryon, she stole some of the herd and insisted the hero mate with her before she would return them. He did so, and through her became the ancestor of a line of Scythian kings. Here is an illustration of Parthian cavalrymen with a dragon banner. Originally a Scythian group from Central Asia, the Arsacids, known in Greek and Roman accounts as the Parthians, founded a powerful empire that at its zenith ruled a vast territory stretching from Central Asia to Syria and from Armenia to the Persian Gulf. The armies of the Arsacid, Parthian Empire, were some of the most accomplished, efficient, and feared of all military forces of antiquity. Here are some Sarmatian mercenaries in Roman service carrying a Draco. The Dacian Draco was a wind instrument used in war that took the form of a dragon head mounted on a pole, with a fabric tube affixed to the rear. While in use, the Draco was held up into the wind, where it filled up and gave the impression it was alive, while making a shrill sound in the wind. They say that for some reason the Romans stole this from them, inspiring the Roman Draco. Yet, the Greek military writer Arrian describes the Draco in his passage on cavalry training exercises, referring to it as specifically Scythian banners. There is also the Celtic or Gaulish Carnix. There's an example of a dragon-headed Carnix in the base of Trajan's column. The Carnix has been described as identical to a Dacian trumpet. There is a clear similarity between Gaulish Carnix and the Dacian Latin dragon standard in jewelry with dragons and serpents. A dragon-headed Carnix also appears to be held by a Gallic woman on the breastplate of Augustus. Now allegedly, the Scythians were illiterate, yet they managed to influence several different cultures and had extremely advanced craftsmanship. They were creating some of the most beautiful and detailed works of art, completely made of gold, with extreme detail. This style of Scythian gold can be found all over Central Asia and Eastern Europe. Many of these works are over 2,000 years old and depict dragons. The Scythians were the Celts, or better explained as the Druids, the megalithic race of Ireland, the elven dragon race. The Druids held the symbols of the serpent and the dragon in the highest esteem, and considered them insignias of royalty. They referred to themselves as Nadreds. This word means wise serpent. It may be connected to the Hebrew Nasians, a title meaning serpent priest from Nasi meaning saintly leader, and to Nagas, a Hindu word meaning kingly serpents. According to Manly P. Hall, quote, "The priest of the mysteries were symbolized as a serpent, sometimes called Hydra. The serpent kings reigned over the earth. It was these serpent kings who founded the mystery schools which later appeared as the Egyptian and Brahmin mysteries. The serpent was their symbol. They were the true sons of light, and from them have descended a long line of adepts and initiates." End quote. Mainstream history will tell us that the Scythians migrated east to west, later becoming the Celts. However, this was simply a return to the homeland, the land of the Pendragons, the kingly bloodline that went back to antediluvian times. From Helena Blavatsky, quote, "In every ancient language, the word dragon signified what it now does in Chinese, the being who excels in intelligence." End quote. In brief, after the deluge, the Arya, or the true dragon elven empire, began to move west to east out of Ireland. The migration is associated with the movement of the tribes of Israel, who carried advanced knowledge and traditions. They traveled through regions such as Egypt, Asia, and Tartaria and became known by different names, including the Tocharians, the Huns, the Saka, Scythians, the Sumerians, and the Ainu peoples. This group originally formed a large empire known as Scythia, which later evolved into the civilization of Tartaria. The biblical term for the Scythians was Gog and Magog, meaning giants and supernatural men. Quote, "Could these have been the Scythians from Tartary? The descendants of the wise men who gave their religion in the arrow-headed letters to Assyrian Semitic conquerors, who had come down as Turanian roamers to the plains of Babylon, and whose Chaldean faith spread even to Egypt and Europe?" From James Bonwick, Irish Druids and Old Irish Religions, 1894. Quote, "The different races of Scythians, which have successfully appeared on the border provinces of Persia and India, are the following: Sakas or Sakai, the Sioux or Sai of the Chinese, Kushans or Tokhari, the great Yu Chi of the Chinese, Kitaratai or later Kushans, the little Yu Chi of the Chinese, Ephthalites or White Huns, the Yethalito of the Chinese." From Cunningham, 1888. The Hungarians traced their lineage to the White Huns, a branch of the Scythians, whose migrations across Eurasia left indelible marks on various cultures. A small faction of Scythians, driven by events lost to time, ventured into Egypt and intermarried to become known as the Hyksos, establishing themselves as rulers of Egypt. From the Hyksos, there came corruption and arose the Atenist faction, which reorganized their power into a monotheistic cult centered on Aten, the solar deity. This cult later dispersed, influencing global events and traditions, including the invasion of Ireland by the Milesians. This invasion marked a critical turning point in the beginning of the annihilation of the earlier dragon elven race, a mystical and advanced people whose tradition and knowledge were targeted for destruction. The Atenists preserved fragments of the original dragon court, though in a corrupted form, embedding these elements into secret orders that eventually influenced Freemasonry. The Merovingians, believed to descend from the dragon lineage, maintained this bloodline and were known for their distinct red hair, a trait symbolizing their Scythian heritage. Their lineage was intimately tied to the esoteric lore of the Holy Grail, representing the preservation of mystical and genealogical power through blood. Central to this agenda was the veneration of bloodlines, with intermarriage among elite families, ensuring not only the preservation of political and royal privileges, but also the retention of esoteric powers tied to specific genetic inheritances. The Atenists formed the foundational framework for Christianity, which acted as a vehicle for their consolidation of spiritual and political dominance. Their influence was instrumental in the reset that involved the Crusades and the systematic dismantling of paganism, a term often used to obscure the remnants of the earlier Dragon Empire and its esoteric traditions. This effort culminated in the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire, which served as a centralized power structure under their control. Central to this empire was the double-headed eagle, symbolizing the phoenix, an emblem of the reset phase, representing renewal and domination following the destruction of the previous Dragon Empire. This is the story encapsulated in the myth of Quetzalcoatl. The Aztecs believed in a white, bearded god named Quetzalcoatl, who had departed into the east with the promise of one day returning. When Hernan Cortés and his crew of Spaniards came ashore, Montezuma proclaimed Cortés to be Quetzalcoatl himself, leading to the empire being handed over without resistance. This moment represents the hijack and erasure process, the legacy of the previous dragon race departing, only to return in a new, corrupted and controlled form under the guise of a divine dynasty. But let's come back to Vlad the Impaler. Then what was the Order of the Dragon? We're told it was just a chivalric order, but what does that even mean? They essentially were like a more Eastern Knights Templar. This was an early secret society with Grand Masters of the Order. But were they a part of this Dragon Empire, or what were they? It was not called just Order of the Dragon, but it was actually Order of the Defeated Dragon. Quote, "The Order of the Defeated Dragon, Society of the Dragonist, was a monarchical, chivalric order for selected nobility, founded on the 12th of December in the year of our Lord, 1408, by Sigismund, King of Hungary, and later Holy Roman Emperor from 1433 to 1437. It was fashioned after the military orders of the Crusades, requiring its initiates to defend the cross and fight the enemies of Christianity, in particular, the Ottoman Turks." End quote. The society was not an order of dragons, but they were the Dragon Slayers. Quote, "The Edict of 1408 describes two insignia to be worn by members of the order. We, and the faithful barons and magnates of our kingdom, shall bear and have, and do choose and agree to wear and bear, in the manner of society, the sign or effigy of the dragon, incurved into the form of a circle, its tail winding around its neck, divided through the middle of its back, along its length from the top of its head right to the tip of its tail, with blood forming a red cross flowing out into the interior of the cleft by a white crack, untouched by blood, just as and in the same way that those who fight under the banner of the glorious martyr, Saint George, are accustomed to bear a red cross on a white field." End quote. So they were ordered to wear an insignia that depicted a dragon in the shape of a circle being choked by its own tail, and on its back it is bleeding a red cross? Why the symbolism? What does it all mean? It would seem that this Order of the Dragon is actually a hijack process in which the previous Dragon Empire was taken over, destroyed, and recycled. Vlad is really only seen as a hero locally. Everywhere else in Europe, he is described as being brutal with his enemies, in which they would be staked. But who were these enemies, and were they really Turks? This gets into Jesus speaking Arabic, and how the previous civilization or empire was a combination of Christian and Islamic motifs. A subject far too extensive to discuss in full detail right now, but the entire story of Vlad fighting off the Turks could be a cover-up for the peoples that were there before. Vlad is descended from the house of Basarab. If we look at the coat of arms for the house, we can see that it's depicted as a black crow or raven, biting or eating a cross with a star and crescent off to the side, as if it were stealing the cross. After watching the video on Jesus Spoke Arabic, you'll see how the star and crescent was featured on many early Christian artworks, and there seemed to have been a merging of both, belonging to a previous civilization that was erased from history. The House of Draculesht also features the star and crescent. Why would they use this symbol if they were actively fighting the Ottomans, who were known to use this for Islam? They say that Vlad II initially allied with the Ottomans as a vassal to maintain power, and then Vlad III rebelled against the Ottomans and refused tribute. It makes more sense that this House of Dracula and the Order of the Defeated Dragon are actually the hijackers and use dark magic in order to accomplish this. This theme is replicated in the story of Saint George, another dragon slayer. In this depiction, Saint George is defending Christianity by defeating a dragon that had been requiring the sacrifice of humans until the saint saved a princess from being eaten. On the medieval depictions of this event, we see that Saint George, or the Red Cross Knight, has a white shield and red cross. The mainstream account will have you believe that it simply symbolizes good over evil. But why a dragon? Again, this story seems layered with multiple meanings. On one side, you have the story being associated with alchemy. Saint George is the alchemist, while the dragon is the prima materia, the raw chaotic substance that the alchemists seek to transform. The princess symbolizes divine wisdom, or Sophia. Through her liberation, it signifies the attainment of higher knowledge. The battle itself is the alchemical process, Negredo, the initial confrontation. Albedo is the purification, and the Rubedo is the final stage, symbolized by the slaying of the dragon and the attainment of the Philosopher's Stone. While all that may be true, the other aspect to this is that we have another alchemist dragon slayer, so an occult order defeating a dragon, which typically would symbolize a group of people or even an empire. Same with St. Patrick's driving out the snakes of Ireland, symbolizing the removal of so-called pagans from Ireland. Here, St. George has a similar meaning. It is Christianity defeating the previous culture, or what is conveniently labeled as the evil or pagan ones. This is the Dragon Scythian race that was hijacked by the new powers that be. Let's acknowledge the similarity between the symbol for the Order of the Dragon and the Ouroboros used by the alchemist. The only difference is that the dragon is being choked instead of swallowing its own tail, and there is a bloody red cross. While Draco in Latin does indeed mean dragon, Dracul in Romanian actually means the devil. So Dracula means son of Dracul, or son of the devil. Some modern accounts say he drank the blood of his enemies on at least one occasion, and there is a woodcut depicting him feasting while surrounded by victims impaled on stakes. Now remember, most people on this subject of Dracula's relationship to Vlad III is through the name of his father and how it was bestowed upon him through the Order of the Dragon, meaning the connection is based on the name Dracul alone. However, there is a clue in Dracula that can help us tie this all together. You see, the mix-up is people are trying to find direct evidence of Vlad III being a vampire, as it is discussed in folklore around Europe, such as being excommunicated or coming back from the dead to mess with his family or townsfolk. However, what if that is not the connection that Stoker was trying to make with Dracula, and there's actually another reason he decided to choose that name and connect the famous literary Dracula to Vlad the Impaler? In the novel, Stoker actually implies how Count Dracula became a vampire. There is a part where Arminius tells Van Helsing Quote, "They learned his secrets in the Scholomance, amongst the mountains over Lake Hermannstadt, where the devil claims the 10th scholar as his due." End quote. Note that we know that Stoker believed Dracula to mean devil. He also has the Count using the pseudonym of Count de Ville, and we read, quote, "The Draculas were, says Arminius, a great and noble race, though now and again were scions who were held by their coevals to have held dealings with the evil one." End quote. The evidence stacks up that it was at the Scholomance that Count Dracula consorted with the devil, and I don't think it's a stretch to offer the theory that it is his attendance at the Scholomance that was the source of the Count's vampirism. But what is the Scholomance? First, we have to talk about Emily Gerald. She was a 19th century author who was connected to royalty, best known for her collections of Transylvanian folklore that influenced Stoker's Dracula. In her book on Transylvanian superstitions, there is a section discussing the legend of the Scholomance. Quote, "I may as well here mention the Scholomance, or school supposed to exist somewhere in the heart of the mountains, and where all the secrets of nature, the language of animals, and all imaginable magic spells and charms are taught by the devil in person. Only 10 scholars are admitted at a time, and when the course of learning has expired, and 9 of them are released to return to their homes, the 10th scholar is detained by the devil as payment, and mounted upon a dragon, he becomes henceforward the devil's aide-de-camp, and assists him in making the weather, that is to say, preparing the thunderbolts." End quote. Notice the reference to dragon, and the thunderbolts part could be symbolic, a way of saying these were the new rulers of the land, the Zeus or Thors who would control from above. This reference directly connects the Scholomance to the Order of the Dragon, which was known for being a group of alchemists and practitioners of black magic. That would mean that Dracula is not connected to Vlad the Impaler just through name, but actually because this is the secret history of a lineage of evil royal alchemists, the real vampires. Now that we have this secret clue, we can further connect how this very well is the real connection between Dracula and Vlad, and what Dracula actually represents. The founder of the Order of the Dragon was founded by Sigismund of Luxembourg, Holy Roman Emperor from 1433 until his death in 1437. While it's not exactly clear whether he was interested in alchemy or the occult, his wife, who was also a co-founder of the order, was deeply associated with alchemy and black magic. Barbara von Cilly, also known as the Black Queen or the Vampire Queen, was the co-founder of the Order of the Dragon. In the 15th century, she became the Queen of Hungary and later the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire due to her marriage to Sigismund of Luxembourg. She was born around 1390 and was the daughter of the noble family of Cilly in present-day Slovenia. Barbara inherited a unique genetic marker, haplogroup T, which suggests likely secret Jewish ancestry. Barbara had a reputation as an astrologer and alchemist. Stanislav Yushnich described Barbara as the richest female alchemist of all time, and how she used very expensive but easily breakable tools for her experiments, such that today there is no remaining evidence. In a manuscript that is now lost around 1440, the Bohemian alchemist Johann von Laz is said to have reported on their alchemical experiments in the castle above Samobor, where she kept a laboratory in the basement. In Croatian folklore, Barbara is often identified with the figure of the Black Queen. The Black Queen is described as a lady with long black hair who dressed herself in black. There are dark legends about Black Queen Barbara that are still widely known today, including the queen had many lovers. When she did not like them anymore, she would throw them over the wall of her castle. She was a bird whisperer who kept a pet black raven that would attack people on her command. She asked the devil to protect Medvedgrad against invading Turks, offering her own life to him. Later, she tried to trick the devil, but failed. She has even been portrayed as a lesbian vampire, a beautiful, one of the traits of older chronicles and historians agreed about her, but nefarious creature. This connects back to Carmilla and shows that these were not just made-up literary devices, but secret references by Masons. The vampiristic stories originated at least partly from Piccolomini's account. Aeneas Silvio Piccolomini, later to be elected Pope Pius II, chronicled Barbara in his Historia Bohemica, written in 1458, where he accused her of associating with heretics and denying the afterlife, and claimed that after the death of Albert II, Barbara and her daughter Elizabeth used to profane the Holy Communion by drinking real human blood during the liturgy. This would, even by modern medical standards, qualify Barbara as a living vampire. Barbara was also accused of maintaining a female harem and staging huge sexual orgies with young girls. Okay, so what we have is that the co-founder of the Order of the Dragon was accused in 1458 of denying the afterlife and drinking human blood in ritual fashion. This undeniably connects the Order of the Dragon to vampirism, not the vampires of folklore, but the secret society esoteric vampires that are hidden from the light. There is even a claim that in the Adoration of the Lamb scene in the Ghent altarpiece, where the lamb is being drained of blood, the leader of the female martyrs at the top right is probably another crypto portrait of the queen. Now this is a deep rabbit hole. This is really only the beginning. We're about to see what the Order of the Dragon was really about. Remember, mainstream history says that the Order of the Dragon declined after 1437, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Let's first discuss the connection between the Order of the Dragon and the Rosicrucians. According to Francis Yates in the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, the Rosicrucian movement was the result of the visit of the English sorcerer John Dee to Prague and Bohemia under Ferdinand I's grandson, Emperor Rudolf II, Grand Master of the Order of the Golden Fleece and a Knight of the Order of the Garter. The occult underground had remained invisible until they announced themselves to the world as the Order of the Rosy Cross, also known as the Rosicrucians. The name recalls the Templar Knights, as well as the Holy Vem Tribunal, to which belonged Emperor Sigismund, and whose symbol was a red cross on a white background. The words Vem or Femme, according to Gottfried Leibniz, the famous scientist and Rosicrucian, were derived from fama, as the law founded on common fame. In contemporary documents, the members of the Vem were frequently referred to under the name of Rose Croix. End quote. So what this means is that the Rosicrucian movement can be directly tied to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. Not only was he emperor, but he was deeply involved in esoteric traditions and was part of multiple orders, like the Order of the Golden Fleece and the Order of the Garter. Notably, Rudolf was a direct descendant of Emperor Sigismund, the founder of the Order of the Dragon, which also uses symbolic imagery of the Red Cross, similar to the Rosicrucian emblem. Both Rudolf II and Sigismund belonged to the House of Luxembourg-Habsburg. Emperor Rudolf II was well known for his obsession with alchemy and the occult, and he even employed numerous alchemists and occultists at his court in Prague, including figures like John Dee and Edward Kelly. His entire life mission was to find the Philosopher's Stone, giving him immortality and eternal youth. Sigismund was also a member of the Vemkirche, also known as the Holy Vem, which was a powerful secret tribunal that operated in medieval Germany, particularly Westphalia, from the 13th to 16th centuries. Its origins allegedly trace back to Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony in 772 AD, where it began as a covert organization to suppress paganism. Members were known as the Knowers or the Rose Croix. They used secret signs, passwords, and multiple initiation stages. Required absolute secrecy from members, even from family. It included powerful figures from church and state. They conducted ritualistic midnight tribunals in underground locations, and had specific symbolic tools in Kabbalistic inscriptions. But I found this to be extremely strange. This order had secret soldiers of light, masked men who would nail a summons to the gates of a castle. A noble who would choose to obey the summons would arrive late at night at a designated place. Masked men would emerge and place a hood on his head. At midnight, the hood would be removed, and the accused would find himself in a vast underground vault. Facing the tribunal, masked and dressed in black, there is a tradition that one of the methods of execution was telling the victim to go and kiss the statue of the Virgin, a type of Iron Maiden. On approaching it, its doors would open and the victim was drawn in and closed around him by a secret mechanism before falling through a trap door and being cut to pieces. Historical records suggest connections between the Vem and other secret societies, like the Templars and Assassins. So they were fighting against pagans and yet they were doing rituals underground and were well versed in Kabbalah? As mentioned, there are notable similarities between the Order of the Dragon and the Knights Templar, particularly their shared emblem of the Red Cross. Beyond their martial endeavors, the Templars were deeply engaged in alchemical studies. The idea of protecting Christianity is just a front. These orders were all a part of the reset and actively participating in occult practices. Emperor Sigismund's connection to the occult don't stop there. Another fascinating leak is Sigismund appears in a grimoire titled The Book of Abramelin, a book that was cherished by the Golden Dawn. The earliest existing manuscripts date from 1608 and are written in German. There is an alchemical book by Nicholas Flamel published in London in 1624 as Exposition of Hieroglyphical Figures that claims Flamel bought the grimoire in 1357. The book tells the story of an Egyptian mage named Abramelin, who taught a system of magical and Kabbalistic secrets to Abraham of Worms, a Jew in Worms, Germany, presumed to have lived from approximately 1362 to 1458. After concluding his studies with Abramelin, Abraham recounts that he traveled to Hungary and employed his skills to give the Emperor Sigismund a, quote, familiar spirit of the second hierarchy, even as he commanded me, and he availed himself of its services with prudence, end quote. What that means is this Abraham of Worms gave Emperor Sigismund, the leader of the Order of the Dragon, a familiar spirit, an entity that would do different services for the Emperor that would be for divining, so kind of like an old AI, but it could see what was going to happen in the future and watch guard on the property to alert if needed. Abraham of Worms also confesses to having used magical means to bring about Sigismund's marriage with his second wife, Barbara of Scilly, the Black Queen, with whom he co-founded the Order of the Dragon in 1408. So now we know that their marriage was established through magic and occult means, but not just that. This Abraham of Worms was an alchemist who was controlling the royal bloodlines and influencing who would inherit the throne. But one weird thing that I noticed while I was looking through this book is there's this insane reference inside of it that's pretty mind-blowing. Apparently, Abraham of Worms summoned 2,000 artificial cavalry to support Frederick I in his war against the Hussites. And in the footnote, it even says he may have slipped up, and it was actually 20,000 strange and foreign warriors who came unexpectedly to range themselves under the standard of Frederick. Okay, so are we talking about cyborgs or some type of lost AI tech like the Brazen Head using occult magic? It could be that or some type of army of the undead. Now let's discuss the Bathory family and how it's connected to the Order of the Dragon and descends from Emperor Sigismund. Sigismund's daughter was Elizabeth of Luxembourg, who has a line of succession leading to Stephen Bathory, marrying into the lineage. Many Hungarian noble families, such as Bathory, retained the emblem of the Order of the Dragon on their coat of arms, and there is even a legend which places the origin of Bathory to the year 900. It tells of a god-fearing warrior called Vitus, who set out to fight a dragon, which dwelt in the swamps next to the castle of Etched. Vitus killed it with 3 thrusts of his lance and received the castle as a reward. The grateful people honored him with the names Bathory, meaning good hero, and Animus Magnimus. Apparently, the Bathory coat of arms was styled in reference to this legend. 3 horizontally placed teeth, surrounded by a dragon biting its own tail. Stephen Bathory was also responsible for financing the experiments of John Dee and was deeply interested in the occult arts. Stephen Bathory has an ancestor named Stephen V Bathory, from a century before him, who was in alliance with Vlad the Impaler to help him reclaim the Wallachian throne in 1476. Stephen Bathory from the 16th century was the uncle of Elizabeth Bathory, known as the Blood Countess, and is regarded as the worst female serial killer in history, who was said to bathe in the blood of young virgins to retain her youth. Through her family, Elizabeth was exposed to the occult and black magic from an early age. Her uncle was a professed alchemist and practitioner of black magic. Elizabeth's aunt, Clara Bathory, a distinguished lady at the court, was reputed to be a witch and lesbian. To make matters worse, her nurse from childhood, Ilona Yu, who was one of those arrested for these crimes in 1610, was steeped in the practice of black magic that reportedly required the sacrifice of children for their bones and blood. Apparently, she had a manservant named Thorko who introduced her to the occult. During the start of the 1600s, when she was 40 years old and her husband died, she grew increasingly vain and feared the thought of aging and losing her beauty. It is said that she was extremely beautiful and spent hours of her day admiring herself in the mirrors. By this time, she had already dabbled in forms of sorcery and witchcraft, working with 2 witches named Darvila and Dorothea, with some claiming she had attended rituals that included the sacrificing of horses and other animals. However, it was about to get much worse. So this stuff is about to get pretty horrifying. So just a warning before we move any further. One day, a servant girl accidentally pulled Elizabeth's hair while combing it. Elizabeth slapped the girl's hand so hard she drew blood. The girl's blood fell into Elizabeth's hand, and she immediately thought her skin took on the freshness of her young maid. Supposedly, this is how she discovered that this was the way to eternal youth. Elizabeth had her accomplices, Major Domo and Thorko, strip the maid and cut her and drain her blood into a huge vat. Then, Elizabeth bathed in it to beautify her entire body. Elizabeth began hosting large, orgiastic occult sessions, during which she and her servants would torture the chambermaids. Elizabeth's servants were known to circulate in a black carriage with its black horses through the village each night to lure young victims back to the castle. For the next 10 years, Elizabeth had her henchmen provide her with new young girls for these blood-draining rituals in her bloodbaths. There's even a claim that she went out of her way to see to it that these girls had proper Christian burials by a local pastor, at least initially. But the pastor refused because he started to catch on that there were so many girls being brought to him dying from unknown and mysterious causes. Not sure about the burial part, because why would someone so evil care about that? But she then started disposing of the bodies secretly to keep this practice hidden. Sometime in 1610, one of her intended victims actually escaped and told the authorities about what was happening at the castle. The governor of the province was ordered to raid the castle on December 30th, and they discovered some terrible sights. There was a dead girl in the main room, drained of blood, another alive whose body was pierced with holes. In the dungeon, they discovered more living girls whose bodies had been pierced several times, and below the castle they found the bodies of over 50 girls. A trial was held, and Elizabeth refused to plead guilty or innocent, and never even showed up to the trial. However, her accomplices were forced to testify. Major Domo testified that about 37 unmarried girls had been killed, 6 of whom he had personally recruited to work at the castle. The trials revealed that most of the girls were tortured for weeks or even months. They were cut with scissors, pricked with pins, and even prodded with burning irons into short spikes in a cage hung from a ceiling to provide Elizabeth with a blood shower during her sex orgies. The trial showed, in fact, that Elizabeth killed over 612 women, and in her diary, she documented these deaths. A complete transcript of the trial was made and it still survives today in Hungary. Everyone involved was beheaded except for Elizabeth and the 2 witches, as it was against the law for nobility to be executed. So, she was put on house arrest and sentenced to life imprisonment, where stone masons were instructed to wall up the windows and doors, locking herself inside. Another serial killer connected to royalty was Gilles de Rais, who somehow manages to outshine Elizabeth Bathory, a war hero who fought alongside Joan of Arc and earned fame for helping liberate Orleans during the 100 Years' War. He then carried out some of the most sickening crimes in history. He's labeled as one of the worst criminals of all time, accumulating between 600 to 800 victims, though some sources suggest the number could be higher. His victims were primarily young children and peasants from the surrounding villages of his castle. After depleting his fortune, Gilles became obsessed with alchemy and black magic, believing it would restore his wealth. He built laboratories in his castle's wing and hired alchemists from across Europe, including Francois Prelati and Antonia di Palermo. His methods were particularly brutal. Children would be lured into his castle with promises of food or work, then tortured and killed in his private chambers. Many victims were sexually assaulted before death, and their bodies were often mutilated as a part of ritualistic ceremonies. Not only that, but apparently he would eat their flesh, one of the reasons he's remembered as a medieval vampire. The murders appeared directly tied to these occult practices. According to trial documents, Gilles' first ritual murder involved dismembering a child, removing organs, and offering them to demons. The blood was used to write magical formulas and conduct ceremonies. Bodies were arranged in specific ritual patterns, and parts were preserved for future rites. His servants testified that he would read from occult texts during these killings and often time them to align with satanic calendars and festivals. His trial in 1440 brought forth extensive evidence of his occult activities. The court discovered grimoires, ritual tools, and alchemical equipment in his castle. Multiple witnesses described black masses and demon summoning ceremonies. Gilles himself confessed to attempting to make pacts with demons named Baron and Orient, believing they would grant him knowledge, power, and gold. He was executed by hanging and burning on October 26, 1440, along with 2 of his servants. Despite his crimes, he showed extreme remorse at his execution, asking forgiveness from the parents of his victims and requesting a Christian burial. Well, for some reason, I doubt that he was truly sorry if there were really 800 victims or more. But what are the implications of this level of ritual murder and vampirism in the early 15th century? The scale and sophistication of ritualistic murders by nobles like Gilles de Rais and Elizabeth Bathory points to organized occult knowledge among medieval European elites. These weren't just random acts. Both cases show specific ritual patterns, alchemical knowledge, and similar victim selection. The detailed grimoires, ceremonies, and black magic practices found in Gilles' castle required extensive study. Considering the limited access to written materials in the 15th century and the church's strict control of information, these nobles likely gained their occult knowledge through secret, aristocratic networks. The fact that both hired multiple experts in black magic and alchemy suggests an underground network of practitioners. While his confession may have been genuine, 800 plus victims indicates this went far beyond one man's madness. It points to an established tradition of dark practices among medieval nobility. There are some original members of the Order of the Dragon that we didn't discuss who also had a deep obsession with alchemy and the occult, such as Stefan Lazarevich the Tall, known for patronizing scholars and maintaining a library containing alchemical and astrological texts. He's referenced as having an early reference to the basilisk in one of his poems, which is deeply associated with alchemy. And Hermann II of Scilly, Barbara or the Black Queen's father, was also known to have extensive libraries on astrology and alchemy. Let's not forget Vlad III himself, as we can see secret symbolism in one of his portraits. There is one portrait in particular that has gained a lot of interest, which depicts astrological symbolism on his crown or cloth headband, indicating that he was well versed in the occult and mystical arts. There is an article that discusses how the diadem itself contains precise astronomical symbolism related to Venus-Earth conjunctions. The topaz gem in a square setting represents the 730-day conjunctions, while the 5 large pearls symbolize the pentagram pattern created by Venus's 584-day orbital cycle. The 8-pointed golden star mirrors an ancient Sumerian symbol for Venus, completing the crown's astronomical significance. This symbolism links Vlad to ancient esoteric traditions, implying his association with a school or order where this knowledge was venerated. It becomes clear that the Order of the Dragon was far more than a mission to protect Christianity. It served as a vehicle for safeguarding arcane secrets accessible only to an elite few, some of which abused this power. If the Order of the Dragon wasn't a Christian military order, then what was it? It would appear that it was a secret society of alchemists, or the Scholomance, the School of Solomon, in which once initiated, one would be bestowed title of dragon. These were the new dragons, or the dragon slayers who replaced the previous dragon empire through their use of dark magic. Not only were they an occult order, but the Order of the Dragon was one of the primary power structures controlling Europe after the Reset. Through strategic marriages and overlapping memberships of other prestigious orders such as the Order of the Golden Fleece and Garter, these nobles maintained control across the continent while appearing to operate as separate kingdoms. What history recorded as independent royal courts was actually a carefully coordinated web of power. Their reach extended from Spain through southern Italy, across the Holy Roman Empire and even into England. This wasn't just about territorial control, it was about creating an invisible network of aligned interests that could shape European politics while appearing to be natural rivals. This sheds light on why Stoker would have linked Dracula to Vlad the Impaler. It was more than just because of the name Dragon and his reputation for being a brutal leader. Bram Stoker was a close friend and associate of the Welsh Golden Dawn magician and writer Arthur Machen, who wrote numerous works including a paper on the alchemical significance of the dragon and a novel on the Tylwyth Teg, the fairies of Wales. It has been suggested that Stoker was a member of the OTO, or the Golden Dawn. It's not a stretch to conclude that Stoker must have had access to a source of esoteric information far more informed in historical and alchemical terms than the folklore of Romanian peasants or contemporary literary sources. This would explain why Dracula is connected to Transylvania, as historical accounts tell us Vlad III was the Prince of Wallachia. Dracula is associated with Transylvania because Stoker is telling us the origin of this elite vampirism, which involves ancient occult rites. Let's not forget that he was a master mason, and while many tend to believe that Freemasonry spawned out of nowhere in the 18th century, its origins go back to the Rosicrucians, and then before that, other chivalric orders, such as the Templars and the Order of the Dragon. Freemasonry even has a nod to this in their degrees, as the Rose Croix is the 18th degree of the Scottish Rite. Now we can understand that the origins of the literary vampire is based on the real vampire, a secret tradition of elite occult blood rituals passed through corrupted bloodlines that seek immortality and eternal youth through the Philosopher's Stone. The Ouroboros, a serpent or dragon devouring its tail, represents endless continuity in the unbroken cycle of life and death. The entire pursuit of the alchemist was to discover the Philosopher's Stone, a legendary substance believed to transmute base metals into gold. However, beyond material wealth, the Philosopher's Stone was also thought to grant immortality by producing the elixir of life, capable of rejuvenation and prolonging life. In all early literary works of the vampire, they are referenced with being associated with royalty. The reason vampires cannot go into the light is because this is an esoteric secret reserved for those in the order. Vampirism being spread after a bite is a reference into recruiting more initiates into the order. Stoker mixed this secret esoteric rite with the folklore of supernatural vampires, which, while they both are a real phenomena, they are two different things. They are connected, however. These rites began with ancient blood magic, practiced by noble bloodlines in a sacred and disciplined manner, distinct from the corrupted forms seen in later times. The blood of a princess, offered willingly and born of deep love for the one performing the ritual, served as a bridge between realms. The act was not an act of taking, but of shared transformation, symbolizing the union of energies to achieve a higher state of being. This blood magic was a practice of elevating consciousness, fostering a collective awareness that transcended individual barriers. By merging their essences, participants created a form of shared mind, a hive-like consciousness that enhanced understanding, empathy, and unity within the group. This interconnected state was not about domination, but about harmonizing with the underlying matrix of life, aligning their spirits with the universal order that wove all existence together. It may seem strange, but this practice has even made its way into Christian rites, which all of you might be quite familiar with. The wine of the Eucharist, symbolically transformed into the blood of Christ, is consumed by the faithful as an act of unity with their Savior. This is similar to ancient blood rituals, where consuming blood, real or symbolic, was believed to transfer power, life force, or divine essence from one being to another. The implications of this are profound. By drinking the blood of their God, Christians participate in a ritual that, at its core, bears similarities to ancient occult practices. It signifies a merging of the divine and mortal realms, where the essence of a higher being is eternalized to create a closer connection to the sacred. The act is the essence of blood magic: transformation, unity, and elevation of consciousness through shared essence. While Christianity has distanced itself from associations with the occult, the symbolic consumption of divine blood can be viewed as a deeply mystical act. It wasn't until greed and selfish desire for power came into play that this practice became corrupted and grew into a dark art among the elites. Once the bloodline became tainted and the battle for rulership began, a rediscovery of ancient mysticism began, often leading to dark avenues through the desire to have power. This means that Dracula is a subtle reference to the elite practicing a corrupted form of blood magic to give themselves power and longer lifespans. But that is not the only reference in Dracula. There is the mysterious Bloofer Lady, Lucy Westenra's undead persona, who preys on children. The term Bloofer Lady, likely a child's mispronunciation of beautiful, depicts Lucy's deceptive nature. In this new form, she lures children away with maternal charm, only to feed on their blood. This is hinting at a darker side of the story that mirrors real-world exploitation. Stoker introduces the Bloofer Lady through fictional news articles in the Westminster Gazette, which resemble real-life journalistic accounts of abuse and child exploitation from his time. Notably, W.T. Stead, a journalist and friend of Stoker, published exposés on these subjects, including accounts of how children were lured by seemingly trustworthy figures offering gifts or promises, only to be taken advantage of. Stoker may have been using the symbolism of the Bloofer Lady to subtly expose hidden truths about exploitation and abuse, cloaking these themes in the guise of fiction. The ability for vampires to fly is another interesting reference connected to the occult. This is highlighted in the new Nosferatu movie, where Hutter's wife experiences visions and dreams of the vampire. One of the abilities possessed by elite alchemists is the power to astral project their body and leech onto others' energy fields. In some cases, depending on their strength, they can even manifest physically, whether as shadows or through physical signs like scratches or bite marks. This is a skill wielded by advanced occultists. Those with disciplined mental faculties can latch onto another person simply by will alone, especially if their target lacks protection or is in a vulnerable state of consciousness. While I'm not recommending engaging in such practices, it's important to understand how simple this technique can be in order to protect oneself. There are many forms and levels to this kind of psychic vampirism. For example, if someone wanted to harness the energies of others, they could go into a crowd where energy is being misused, and through visualization alone, absorb it. It's worth noting that balanced individuals who generate their own energy have no need for such practices, as feeding on the energy of others is a reflection of a lower state of mind. Yet many in the modern day lack spiritual protection, making them susceptible. All it would take is someone with advanced visualization techniques, such as imagining astral tentacles reaching out to absorb energy from an intended victim, to drain energy and transfer it to themselves. Again, I strongly discourage this. Depending on others for energy in this way is a sign of weakness, but it illustrates the power of visualization and what some dark occultists practice. How do you protect yourself against astral vampires? There are different methods, and the most vulnerable targets are often those in a state of trauma or emotional distress. Those who are balanced and fully aligned with their personal path are typically immune to such attacks. There are many types of energy vampires, but the solution is universal. Maintain a strong internal energy state and cultivate a sense of balance and well-being. Some achieve this by connecting to a higher power, which is one of the most common and effective defenses. Others might focus on strengthening their energetic field through visualization techniques, such as imagining a protective barrier surrounding their energetic body. Just as a psychic vampire can will the absorption of your energy, you can will the protection and balance of your own energy, a far more powerful approach than relying on others for sustenance. With this understanding, we can piece together the entire nature of the vampire through its three main manifestations: the folkloric vampire, the literary vampire, and the psychic vampire. The folkloric vampire is a creature of nature, most commonly associated with the restless dead or the excommunicated. A spirit, after dying, becomes trapped in limbo within the etheric realm, where its unstable psyche transforms it into a monster. This leads to the creation of an entirely new being, one that feeds on the energies of loved ones to prevent itself from dissipating completely, thereby sustaining the body for a temporary period. These manifestations are not limited to humans, as unruly spirits can also attach themselves to people, as seen with the succubi and incubi. The literary vampire, on the other hand, was invented by Masons and those with esoteric knowledge spanning centuries. It represents the elites who practice corrupted blood magic to achieve immortality. It also symbolizes royalty's secret knowledge of the occult, kept hidden from the masses, such as their ability to astral project for certain rites and rituals. This may sound far-fetched, but historical accounts lend credibility to such claims. For instance, the Benandanti, a 16th century agrarian visionary tradition in Italy, were referred to as the Good Walkers. These were said to be benevolent witches who claimed they could leave their bodies while asleep to battle malevolent witches in the astral realm who were ruining crops and spreading disease. Interestingly, the Benandanti were said to possess this ability because they were born with a caul on their head. Elizabeth Bathory herself was known to keep a caul for its occult powers. The caul has a long history in the occult, regarded as a talisman with mystical properties. Practitioners would often dry and preserve it for years, if not decades, to harness its powers. Let's not forget the Count of Saint Germain. While most have heard of him, one often overlooked detail is his claim to have been the son of Francis II Rákóczi, the Prince of Transylvania. Francis was a member of the Order of the Golden Fleece, and his ancestors were connected to the Order of the Dragon. Saint Germain's immense wealth could be attributed to his family, who were among the wealthiest in Hungary, but both his fortune and his eternally youthful appearance could be also linked to his mastery of alchemy. The Rákóczi family, as initiates of the Order of the Dragon, not only acquired wealth and status, but also knowledge of alchemical practices and the dragon symbol that adorned their family crest. For those unfamiliar with Saint Germain, he's this mysterious historical figure, not a legend, because there's numerous historical accounts that document his existence, and he associated with prominent figures of his time, such as Casanova, Voltaire, and Mozart. Saint Germain was said to be 500 years old, earning him the title Wonder Man from Voltaire, who described him as a man who does not die and knows everything. A well-known alchemist, Saint Germain reportedly never ate in public, spoke several languages fluently, and appeared surprisingly youthful. He was said to have been born in 1691 and continued to make documented appearances into the early 20th century. But one of the most intriguing accounts comes from New Orleans. According to the story, Saint Germain moved to New Orleans in 1902, earning a reputation for hosting lavish dinner parties that entertained the city's aristocracy. Strangely, despite serving extravagant meals, he was never seen partaking in the food. Known as a regular in the French Quarter, he frequented bars nightly to meet young women. One night, screams were heard coming from Saint Germain's home after he brought a woman back from the bar. The woman ran out and begged for help, claiming she had been attacked. Witnesses noted bite marks on her neck, and when the police searched Saint Germain's home, they reportedly found bloodstains and wine bottles filled with blood, but Saint Germain was nowhere to be found. I'll go into American vampires in another video, since that's a topic worth its own discussion, but this story is worth bringing up. It seems clear that vampires and alchemists share a deep connection, both seeking eternal youth through their practices. Now let's explore how these connections have evolved into the modern day. Many of you have probably heard that several US presidents are said to be descended from Vlad the Impaler, also known as Dracula. Even King Charles has publicly acknowledged his descent from Vlad and owns multiple properties in Transylvania, as he is the heir to this dragon bloodline. This claim has been fact-checked even by Snopes and found to be true. Some of you might remember the unveiling of King Charles' portrait, which caused a lot of controversy, but why? Many say that it appears sinister or demonic, perhaps symbolically referencing being soaked in blood. Queen Elizabeth II also shares distant ancestry with Vlad the Impaler through her grandmother, Mary of Teck, who was descended from two of Vlad's sons. Interestingly, several celebrities are also rumored to have ties to Vlad. For instance, Robert Pattinson, known for playing Edward in Twilight, is ironically said to be distantly related to the Impaler himself. It is also possible that Johnny Depp is a distant relative of Vlad the Impaler. Several references online suggest that Depp shares an ancestor with Queen Elizabeth II, which would make Mary of Teck a shared connection. I'm not stating this as fact, but an article in Forbes referencing Vogue notes, quote, "The House of Windsor, from which Queen Elizabeth II and King Charles III are descended, has several distant ties to Hollywood. Actress Hilary Duff is the late Queen's 18th cousin, and both Beyoncé and actor Johnny Depp are 20th cousins. Ralph Fiennes, most famous for his role as Lord Voldemort in the Harry Potter films, is the 8th cousin of King Charles, according to Vogue." End quote. This is particularly intriguing because Depp has portrayed several vampire-like characters in his career, such as Barnabas in Dark Shadows. Even his role as Sweeney Todd could be loosely connected, given its cannibalistic and blood-soaked themes. However, the most bizarre connection lies in his role in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, where there's a scene involving Gonzo claims to have obtained the substance from a Satanist, and when Depp's character takes it, he experiences a psychedelic trip filled with visions of a demon in an altered state of consciousness. Interestingly, this substance is mentioned by Aldous Huxley, where he compares its effects to the symptoms of mescaline intoxication. It's also referenced in A Clockwork Orange, where the characters drink drug-laced milk spiked with a substance called Now, I'm not here to dive into theories about the topic, but rather to point out the similarities. There are more subtle references worth noting. Like with Monsters, Inc., for example. What is that movie really about? Monsters enter through doorways into another realm to collect fear which powers their world? What is this fear? Could it be connected to a On the surface, it's just a cute kids movie, but there are some unsettling underlying themes that hint at a much darker reality. We can also see this in The Dark Crystal. The Skeksis are this cruel and tyrannical elite race that maintain their youth and power by draining the life essence from other beings, particularly the peaceful podlings. This process involving strange alchemical machinery and rituals are referencing energy extraction and occult practices. The essence, once drained, is consumed by the Skeksis to rejuvenate themselves. They are literal vampires that require a dark and parasitic reliance on the vitality of others. Why would a kid's film have this strange focus on these life-draining rituals is beyond me, but there's no doubt that it contains esoteric symbolism and alchemical concepts of life extension through unnatural means. Same for Hocus Pocus, another family-friendly film where three witches, known as the Sanderson sisters, seek to achieve immortality by absorbing the life essence of children. They concoct a potion to drain the youth from their victims, again referencing the idea of life force extraction and dark magic. In Coraline, the Other Mother lures Coraline into a magical world and tries to trap her there. She feeds on the lives of children, stealing their essence to sustain her perfect illusionary world. She is a malevolent, interspatial, shape-shifting witch-fae entity who lures children into another dimension with the goal of consuming their flesh for strength and keeping their souls as her prisoners. The entire story of Tangled is about a witch who uses a magical flower in order to retain youth for hundreds of years. When the flower's power is transferred to Rapunzel, Mother Gothel keeps Rapunzel locked away to maintain her youth by extracting her energy using Rapunzel's hair. Another reference to life force extraction. There are many more references in popular culture, but another interesting aspect to this is there are a bunch of articles and videos discussing how many celebrities don't age at all, or even a BuzzFeed video that claims these celebrities might be vampires in a trolly fashion. But it is interesting to see what all the comments say. Even Jared Leto, when asked what was his secret to being so young, supposedly responded with this. Sure, maybe it's just a joke, but just a weird thing to joke about. Like I said, this rabbit hole goes much deeper, but I prefer to keep these things historical. I just wanted to point out a few references in popular culture to this type of occult practice, especially in family-friendly films, and even bring up the idea that it's still very possible that these real vampires are living among us. That's for you to decide, but regardless, it seems clear that these were not only real entities throughout history, but this practice has been secretly preserved through the literary vampire and all its later derivations. I'll leave it at that. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. We will go into the American vampires in another video, so please stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and all we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?